Buongiorno and welcome to Lamborghini's design studio here on the outskirts of Bologna, where we're here to have a look at the new Lamborghini Urus SE. Now, you might be watching this video at some point around late April when this car has its official debut at the Beijing Motor Show, but we're here a few weeks early to have a walk around and see everything that's new about this new 788 brake horsepower plug-in hybrid SUV. So there are a lot of you out there that I know have very strong feelings about the Urus, but you cannot deny that this car has been a phenomenal success for the Italian brand, bringing with it a lot of money and a resource that it didn't have previously to put towards its sportier models. However, for now, we're talking about the Urus, and there is actually quite a lot to go through in this updated model.
It's worth stating that much like the Porsche Cayenne or the latest Audi Q7, this new Urus SE isn't quite an all-new model, but can be considered a pretty hefty update on the existing car.
The crux of this new model is of course under the bonnet, where the V8 has picked up a hybrid module. Now, peak power is rated at 788 brake horsepower, which is a solid 131 brake horsepower more than the old Performante and the S. The V8 itself is pretty similar to the previous version. It's still a 4-litre and it's still a twin turbo, but in this case produces 611 brake horsepower on its own. Now, of course, that's augmented with a 189 brake horsepower electric motor that's mounted inside of the transmission housing. As well as adding power to the entire powertrain, it also has a torque fill function, which should make this car feel particularly sprightly at low revs. Now, if you're reading between the lines, you will have picked up a few synergies between this and something like a Porsche Cayenne Turbo E Hybrid, but the two systems are quite different. They do share a 25.9 kilowatt-hour battery pack, which sits underneath the rear seats, and it does mean that this car is capable of around 60 kilometers on EV power alone. Doesn't sound very Urus, does it? Lamborghini's system, however, is quite a lot more powerful by the tune of around 60 brake horsepower.
Anyone who's driven the previous Urus will know that it feels considerably more aggressive than the equivalent Cayenne Turbo, so despite sharing lots of that hardware, the new SE should be able to play the same trick.
Of course, there is a penalty when it comes to all of these hybrid elements, and it comes in the form of weight. Now, I haven't been told a specific weight figure for this car yet, but I have been told it will be around 2.5 tons, which makes it around 250 kilograms more than the old non-hybrid version. In terms of acceleration, that means that this car is only just slightly faster than the existing Urus S, despite having that extra power, and it's actually 0.1 of a second slower to 62 than the previous Performante, but that might have something to do with the fact that that car was on a particularly sticky set of Trofeo R tyres. This one does 0 to 62 in 3.3 seconds and will top out at a pretty hefty 180 something miles an hour.
In terms of design, while the SE does share the same body as the previous car, Lamborghini has made some pretty substantial changes at the front and rear. This might be a double take sort of update, but when you really sink your teeth into it, there's a lot to talk about.
I was initially a little bit skeptical about how different this car would actually look in the flesh, but in reality, it actually does look quite a lot different to the last one. That bonnet actually makes a pretty big difference to the way the whole front of the car looks. It looks a lot sportier and a lot less SUV-like somehow. The headlights are also much slicker and a little bit more resolved. But actually, it's around the back that I think makes the biggest difference, because what they've done is that they've pulled out this section here to make it look a little bit more pointy. Now, that might not seem to be a huge difference, but what it does is it kind of makes it look a little bit less like a giant hatchback, which is always a good thing. Lamborghini is also enlarging the color and trim options to this car to a massive 100 or so exterior colors and about 70 interior combinations as well. And they've also launched a new 23-inch forged wheel. And here's a bit of trivia for you as well. Lamborghini were actually the first brand to put a car on sale with the option of 23-inch wheels when the Urus originally came out. Up until now, that record actually hasn't been broken by any manufacturer, aside from Cadillac, who are now putting a massive 24-inch wheel on their all-electric Escalade behemoth. Thankfully, though, that's not coming to Europe. So in here, much like the exterior, it might not immediately look massively different, but there are actually some pretty fundamental changes to the interior cabin as a whole. Now, those changes are largely there to incorporate a much larger 12.3-inch touchscreen display, which is in the center and sits above the previous touchscreen display that you might notice from a few Audis like an A6 or a Q7. Inherently though, it has introduced a brand new dashboard that does actually look and feel considerably more upscale than it did before. Now, that is actually saying quite a lot, because despite the fact that it didn't look particularly posh, the interior of the last Urus was brilliantly made, and this one feels exactly the same. This particular example is finished with this quite funky black and orange interior color scheme, but through Lamborghini's Ad Personam personalization function, you can pretty much spec the interior of the car to be however you like. There's over 70 leather finish combinations, and you can go anywhere from this quite sporty look all the way up to a luxurious semi-aniline sort of leather that you'd expect to find on Italian sofas. The coolest bit of this interior still for me, however, is this bank of switches and levers, which controls everything from the driver modes, the gear selector, and now, because it's a plug-in hybrid, the powertrain. Everything's centered around these 6 driver modes, which go from something more road-based like Strada, something sporty like Sport obviously, and also Corsa, which is designed more for track work. Beyond that, of course, there is then sand, dirt and snow, or sabbia, terra or neve if you want to do it in Italian. Now, associated with each of those drive modes is of course a different powertrain option, and we have everything from EV, a hybrid mode, a battery recharge mode, and also then a full bore performance mode. The great thing is though, is that if you flick through the different driver modes, it then selects or deselects different options for that powertrain. Now the best bit is that once you get bored, you can then flick it back into Strada, and then this is how you put it into EV mode as well, which it starts on automatically, but is very easy to disengage, don't worry. At its center is the typical Lamborghini switch, which is worth its weight in gold. It's awesome.
If you'll permit me to get a little technical for a second, let's talk suspension, because this thing runs an air spring system with up to 90mm of high variation between its lowest and highest settings. There's also the usual anti-roll system, but if you're looking for any super clever fully active systems like you'll find on a Puro Sangue, well, you're hard out of luck.
Which is a tiny little segue for the sign off of this video, because we can't deny that despite the fact that this car came onto the scene with the whole supercar branded SUV thing to itself, it's not the case anymore. Now I know it's very difficult to draw comparisons between this car and something like an Aston Martin DBX or a Ferrari Puro Sangue, but while this car does hit good numbers, it doesn't have quite the same chassis, the same effort in the engine, or indeed the same incredible new age tech around the suspension that those cars generally have. Has Lamborghini gone far enough? Well, I suppose you're going to be able to tell us in the comments below, but I think they've probably done just enough to ensure that this car remains popular and just as profitable as it ever was.